He came to the charity gala as just another guest. But the night turned into a test when three drunken police officers decided that their uniforms would protect them instead of the law. Watch till the end, and make sure to subscribe and comment which city you're watching from. The road leading to the Hilltop Hotel curved through the darkening forest like a ribbon of faint light, its edges lined with lanterns that glowed against the deepening evening. The building itself rose above the trees like a modern estate of glass and polished stone, illuminated by soft golden lighting that made it look more like a private museum than a hotel. Guests in evening gowns and tailored tuxedos were already gathering beneath the entrance canopy, stepping out of luxury cars as valets hurried to take the wheels. The night had that kind of polished calm that money always buys. Nothing rushed, nothing out of place, everything rehearsed into elegance. Among the arrivals was a figure who did not blend in, not because he lacked refinement, but because he carried his own definition of it. Chuck Norris stepped out of the black SUV, closing the door behind him with a casual movement. He was dressed in the style that had become inseparable from his name, a dark cowboy hat shadowing his eyes, a neat checkered shirt tucked into well-worn jeans, boots with the kind of leather that didn't come from a brand store but from years of life. The quiet confidence in the way he stood made the valet hesitate before speaking, as if unsure whether to offer help or step away with respect. Chuck gave a small nod, not unfriendly, just steady, a man who had never needed to announce his status. His wife stepped out beside him, and for a moment the valet forgot how to blink. Her dress was a deep, polished red, flowing like silk poured into shape, catching the light with every step. It wasn't loud or glittering. It was simply arresting, the kind of elegance that didn't need sequins or diamonds. A thin silver pendant rested against her collarbone, a simple shape with personal meaning, something only close people would know. She didn't cling to her husband's arm the way some guests did. They walked side by side like equals, like a pair shaped not by glamour but by experience and shared strength. Inside the lobby, their arrival didn't cause surprise, but a quiet shift in posture, a ripple of recognition that moved from guest to guest. People turned, not to stare, but to confirm what they already suspected. Yes, that really was Chuck Norris, the guest of honor, the man whose presence alone could raise donations by millions. A few younger attendees tried to take discreet pictures with their phones. Older philanthropists nodded with respectful smiles, not approaching yet, just acknowledging him the way one acknowledges a living emblem of strength and integrity. Chuck didn't posture or play for attention. He scanned the room unconsciously the way he always did. Doors, exits, where the crowd thickened, where it thinned, who seemed nervous, who seemed alert, a habit shaped by years of discipline. His wife placed a hand lightly on his arm, reminding him that this was a safe place, a night meant for purpose, not threat. He softened, just enough to press his hand over hers in return. The ballroom beyond the lobby glowed with warm lights and a low swell of jazz from a live quartet. Tables were set with white linen and silver. Staff in black uniforms walked between them with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The walls displayed framed photographs of women, children, and families' faces that told the real story behind tonight's fundraising. The organization behind the event specialized in helping survivors of abuse and power-based violence, and the red ribbon pinned to every guest's attire served not only as symbolism, but as an echo of the mission: to give voice, safety, and legal aid to those silenced by fear. As they walked through the room, guests stepped forward to greet them, not loudly, not with forced energy, but with genuine appreciation that someone with his influence had chosen to lend his name to a cause rather than to a product or a new action film. Chuck exchanged brief but sincere conversations about programs being funded, about the progress last year, about the silent battles still being fought. He didn't talk like a celebrity giving statements. He talked like a man who understood that real strength was measured in what you protected, not in what you could destroy. His wife stood beside him, speaking with quiet conviction, when someone directed a question her way. She had attended similar events before, but something about this evening made her unusually thoughtful. As she listened to the organizers describe the rising number of abuse cases hidden behind uniforms and badges, Her expression tightened, not in fear but in recognition of how much she still needed to change. A coordinator approached Chuck with a polite urgency, apologizing before explaining that the event host needed him for a brief moment backstage to confirm the timing of his speech. Chuck glanced at his wife to make sure she was comfortable. She smiled, touched his hand lightly in assurance, and told him she would wait by the entrance to the terrace, where she could breathe the cool night air and watch the sky before joining the next round of greetings. He agreed, but not before scanning the space one more time, that silent, protective instinct that had never left him. She walked to the tall glass doors that led to the outdoor area, where the music softened into a muted background, and the night air carried the scent of wet earth and trimmed hedges. The patio lights cast faint halos onto the stone floor, and beyond them stretched a gentle slope of lawn leading to the tree line. It was peaceful, almost cinematic, a place untouched by conflict, wrapped in comfort and privilege, where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But even in beautiful places, danger didn't always look like danger at first. Sometimes it walked in wearing a badge. A police car rolled up the drive slowly, not to the main parking circle, but to the darker edge near the trees. The vehicle wasn't part of the event security, nor had anyone requested local enforcement. The officers who stepped out were in uniform, but the relaxed swagger in their walk, the way one stumbled slightly on gravel, and the faint smell of alcohol that drifted behind them suggested they weren't here to serve, but to indulge. Their presence didn't yet seem threatening, just out of place, like a wrong note in an otherwise elegant symphony. The woman in the red dress didn't notice them at first. She was watching the sky reflect against the glass panels of the hotel, the night deepening and the music inside fading into something like distant waves. The breeze touched her hair and the fabric of her dress, shifting it gently around her legs. Her pendant glimmered at her throat like a small protective star. Her quiet moment was still intact. The danger had not yet crossed the threshold into recognition, but the camera above the terrace door pivoted slightly as if adjusting its view. The valet who had taken their car earlier stepped into the lobby and disappeared behind the reception desk. The ballroom doors closed behind a group of guests, sealing the interior sound away. The woman stood alone in the subtle, quiet safe, for now, but watched by something she had not yet seen. And somewhere inside the building, Chuck Norris continued his conversation with the organizers, unaware that he was already moving away from her, one step at a time, into the place in the story where he would not be present when danger first arrived. The night had settled, the music played, the stage was set. There was still peace, but the kind that trembles seconds before a storm. And the storm was already walking toward her. The air outside the ballroom carried that quiet stillness that only appears when most of the noise has moved indoors. The patio lights glowed in soft pools of gold against the stone tiles, while the lawn beyond had already faded into muted shadow. The woman in the red dress stood near the glass doors, her posture relaxed, her gaze distant as she let the night settle around her. From inside came the low murmur of conversations, laughter softened by the thickness of the glass, and the faint rhythm of the jazz quartet, now playing something with slower notes, as if the evening itself were sinking deeper into its own comfort. She did not hear the car at first. It approached the property without the assertive hum of authority, the siren lights dark, the tires crunching softly over gravel rather than the paved guest drive. The police cruiser paused near the tree line, headlights fading before the engine cut off completely. It was an unannounced arrival, but the kind that expected no questions. The doors opened and 3 uniformed officers stepped out, their silhouettes uneven and their movements too loose, as though balance were something they were actively negotiating. The night breeze carried the truth before the sound, did the thick trace of alcohol trailing from their breath and clothes. No one stopped them. No one even saw them. The valet had stepped away. The nearest security guard was stationed near the ballroom entrance, and the hotel staff assumed that anyone in uniform had a reason to be there. They had the quiet confidence of men who had used their badges to bypass scrutiny more than once. One of them laughed too loudly, a short, sharp burst that broke the stillness like a crack in glass. The others shushed him, but not with urgency, more with the lazy amusement of people who genuinely believed that nothing could touch them. Not here, not ever. They walked toward the terrace entrance with the slow pacing of men who had no schedule to obey and no consequences to fear. Their boots struck the stone unevenly, the weight of their bodies leaning just slightly too far forward, just slightly too loose at the joints. The badges on their chests gleamed under the lights, but their uniforms were not the crisp, clean line of duty. They were wrinkled, lightly stained, their belts not properly fastened, one shirt unbuttoned too far at the collar. They were not here as officers. They were here as men who believed the title of officer would excuse anything they chose to do. The woman finally sensed she was no longer alone when the sound of footsteps reached the edge of her awareness. At first she turned only slightly, expecting perhaps another guest stepping out for fresh air, maybe a couple escaping the noise to whisper in the dark. But the sight of the uniforms halted her movement, not in fear, not yet, but in uncertainty. Something about them felt wrong. Not the presence of the police that should have meant safety, but the way they moved, the way they smiled at one another instead of approaching with purpose. They saw her at the same time she saw them, and the shift in their expressions was immediate. Their attention sharpened, not with professionalism, but with the quick, invasive interest of men who had just discovered an unexpected reward waiting in the quiet. One nudged the other with a grin, as if he had just been handed a private joke. They angled their approach toward her, not quickly, not aggressively, but with the deliberate certainty of people who believed that being seen with a badge meant they could walk anywhere, speak to anyone, take whatever tone they wanted. She held her posture, neither walking away nor inviting conversation. A polite nod, a step to the side, not fearful, only cautious. The kind of caution women learn from experience rather than paranoia. But they did not take the hint. They closed a little more of the space between them, not enough to appear threatening, but enough to make retreat feel like something she would now have to consciously plan. The first officer greeted her with a smile that tried to imitate charm, but the alcohol behind it twisted the edges. He leaned slightly too close when he spoke, as though he had forgotten that distance meant respect. The second laughed with him, the kind of laugh meant to reinforce dominance rather than humor. The third stayed a step behind, silent, watching not her, but the surroundings, calculating whether anyone else was near enough to hear or interfere. She answered politely, giving them no reason to escalate and no invitation to continue. She tried to keep her tone firm, neutral, the kind of tone that usually signals boundaries. But boundaries only work on people who respect them. The officers exchanged looks, their amusement deepening, and one of them took another step forward, not toward conversation, but toward possession of space that did not belong to him. She shifted back, only half a step, but that was all it took for them to recognize her discomfort, and instead of backing away, they fed on it. One of them gestured toward the ballroom inside, pretending to ask if she was enjoying the evening, but his eyes were not on hers. They drifted down, up, back down again, as though her humanity had already been replaced by something decorative, something available. With each breath, she became more aware that the distance between her and the doors now felt larger than it truly was. She could see the silhouettes of people moving inside the ballroom, laughing, drinking, unaware. The glass made them look close, but everything inside was sealed away by soundproof walls and music. She could scream right now, and most of those faces would not turn. The officers positioned themselves just slightly apart, enough to surround her without looking like they meant to. One leaned an elbow against the column beside her, cutting off retreat to the right. Another shifted toward the direction of the lawn, blocking her from stepping backward without brushing past him. The third angled closer to the door, not to open it, but to control it. Their positions were not accidental. They knew exactly what they were doing, and she knew then, not from any one action, but from the totality of their presence, that they were not here as protectors. They were here because power, sharpened by alcohol and shielded by darkness, felt like freedom. She breathed slowly, steadying herself. She had seen men like this before. She had survived men like this before. Her fear did not rise in panic. It settled into calculation. How far to the door? How fast she could move in heels? Whether anyone outside might still be near enough to see. Inside the ballroom, the jazz continued seamlessly, the sound of polished comfort and civilized conversation. Outside, 3 badges gleamed under the lights, and the distance between safety and danger shrank by another step. The night was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. The moment stretched like glass drawn thin, delicate enough to shiver at a fingertip. She kept her breathing even and shallow, the way one does on a high ledge, knowing that sudden movement can make the air turn treacherous. The nearest officer, she began to think of them that way, not as individuals, but as a single formation with 3 moving parts, tilted his head as though curious to see how she would react to him standing where he had no right to stand. His hand drifted, not all the way toward her yet, but hovering at the edge of what any reasonable person would call personal space, almost as if he wanted to prove that the mere idea of a boundary entertained him. The second officer smirked with the private delight of a spectator who expects a trick he's seen before. The third stayed angled toward the door with a bored severity, the kind of stillness that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with calculation. She chose her tone carefully when the need for words could no longer be postponed. Polite, clear, neutral in volume, firm in shape. It was the voice of someone who has learned to keep control of the scene, even when she no longer controls the space. She indicated the door with a small movement, explained with gentleness that she was waiting for her husband, that she would be joining the event again in a moment, that the night air was cold and the ballroom warm. It was the kind of explanation that, among people of good faith, signals an ending. But good faith was not present here. It had wandered off with the valet. It had stayed inside with the music. Out on the terrace, authority wore a false face, and good faith was something to be punished. "Just a minute," the first one said, not looking at the door but at the place on her shoulder where a dress strap turned from silk into skin. His smile seemed gentler when he spoke, but his eyes had the steady fixation of someone measuring a surface before placing a hand flat on it. He asked simple questions in a simple voice, questions that would have been harmless if not for the tone and the posture and the fact that there were 3 of them and 1 of her. Was she enjoying the evening? Had she seen the auction items? Had she tried the champagne? Did she know some of the donors? It was a small interrogation staged like banter, the way a card trick looks like magic only because the audience has been lulled into not watching the fingers. She answered only what she had to. She gave nothing away. She tried to decrease the surface area of herself they could reach by turning her body without appearing to shrink. The second officer laughed at something the first said, not because it was humorous, but because laughter carried a message. "We are in this together. You are not." He stepped closer than the first. His breath smelled like liquor masked with mint. The sweetness made it worse. She shifted again. Small movements, each one careful not to broadcast alarm. She was not a deer, and they were not hunters. She would not let them decide the metaphor. When the first hand finally landed on her, it did not feel like a human touch so much as the cold of the night passing through a patch of fabric and finding her skin. It was not a press or a grip at first, only a contact held for a fraction too long, a palm that didn't retreat once it had made its point. The fingers splayed, not to comfort, not to steady, but to mark. She stepped away, exactly 1 stride's length, and said that this was not appropriate, that she would be rejoining the event now. The shape of her words was exact enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. The first officer looked at his hand as if it had wandered off by mistake, then lifted his gaze back to hers with a slowness designed for effect. He was not embarrassed. He was amused. The second one closed some of the distance she'd just reclaimed, angling his shoulder across the line of her path so that stepping around him would require brushing against him. He did it casually with that lazy arrogance that insists on plausible deniability while extinguishing choice. The third, still stationed by the door, rested his knuckles lightly against the handle as if he were merely about to open it and be helpful. He was not helpful. The subtle pressure kept the door's weight in his favor. She might open it, but not without first moving him, not without turning the moment into a struggle, into a scene that she instinctively knew would please them more than it would free her. She kept her tone steady. She did not bargain, because one does not bargain for what is already inherent. She did not plead, because one does not plead for the ordinary mercy of being left alone. She repeated her intention to go back inside. The first officer said something he must have believed sounded flattering. It landed like a stain. She looked him directly in the eyes, not to challenge him. Men like this confuse challenge with desire, but to strip away the shadow of anonymity that emboldened him. He blinked once, surprised to find a person where he had decided there was only a surface. "Don't," she said. A single word, dry as stone. He smiled wider, the way people smile when they hear a word they want to pretend is a joke. When the second hand landed, it was on her elbow, the angle tight enough to direct her rather than guide her. The move was clumsy, a drunk man's attempt at control, and that clumsiness made it worse. She twisted her arm free without a jerk, using the turn of her shoulder to unhook the line of contact, then stepped back so her spine met the cool, clean plane of the column. The texture of the stone pressed through silk and into skin. It served as a landmark, an anchor that confirmed exactly where she was now. She could see the black sheen of the lawn's edge out of the corner of her eye. She could see the reflection of all four figures herself, and the three of them warped and twin in the glass. On the other side of that glass, laughter swelled and fell like a soft tide. No one turned. No one could hear. The first officer reached for her again, quicker this time, impatient with the pretense of politeness. He touched her waist, fingers digging just enough to make the intent unmistakable. She tore away, sidestepping so sharply that her heels slid on the faint sheen of moisture that the night air had left on the stone. She caught herself with the palm of one hand against the column and kept her balance. It was not fear that flashed through her then. It was anger, hot, bright, and controlled. She did not raise her voice. She had seen enough to know that a raised voice can be an invitation to mockery when the world is a step too far to hear the words. She let her silence harden her posture. Let the line of her gaze become the barrier they insisted on ignoring. The third officer at the door glanced back into the ballroom through the pane, his face lit faintly by the reflections of the chandeliers. He did not look for help. He looked to confirm that none was coming, that the glass would go on doing what glass does best. Look open, be closed. He set his hand more firmly on the handle and leaned his weight just enough to hold the door fast without seeming to hold it at all. The first officer spoke again, the rhythm of his voice building a scaffold where there should have been a bridge. He spoke about the dress, about the color, about how vivid it looked under the lights, as if a description could be a compliment, as if a compliment could be an excuse, as if admiration, real or counterfeit, entitled him to proximity. She let the words pass without entering her, like wind flapping a curtain that has been pinned to keep it from blowing free. When the second hand descended, it was not exploratory. It was possessive. It landed low and deliberate, with a crudeness that was neither accidental nor mistakable. She reacted with instantaneous force, wrenching herself away and slamming her palm against his chest to gain space. It wasn't a strike, just a push loaded with all the withheld motion of the last few minutes. He staggered a half step and laughed, shock mixing with a flare of itching anger in his eyes. The first officer swore softly, the kind of word one uses when a game refuses to follow its rules. The third officer straightened at the door and let go of the handle. He didn't move to block her again. He didn't have to. She had not chosen the door. She had chosen defiance, and men like this considered defiance an invitation to escalation. She knew it too. She felt the equation shift. A chill slid down her spine, not from the air, but from the change in theirs. She did not retreat. If she retreated now, she would do so at a run, and running would not be safety. Running would be spectacle. She looked at the camera dome mounted above the glass and let the knowledge of it steady her. The lens had moved earlier. It might be watching now, and if it watched, it might hold. The first officer's face arranged itself into the counterfeit of seriousness, a performance of restraint. He said something about causing a scene, as if the scene had been hers to cause. He moved toward her with the smooth, sliding motion of a hand reaching into a pocket for a familiar tool. She could feel the column cooling her shoulder blade, the silk pulling and whispering with the small shifts of muscle beneath it. The pendant at her throat touched the stone and gave a tiny metallic sound that hardly reached her own ears. It was the sound of a bell struck at a distance, traveling farther than it ought to. The second officer came from the other side. Between them, they performed a choreography of narrowing choices, one close enough to press his presence against her decision-making, the other close enough to make the first pressure feel unavoidable. The third stepped away from the door at last and took up a position that controlled the space behind them all, not to aid them if she ran, but to shape the geography of her options. It was not yet a trap. It was an erasure of the alternatives that make freedom feel natural. She played for time. She lifted her chin a fraction and, without looking away, reached with 2 fingers for the pendant and steadied it against her skin. The gesture was small enough to be misread as vanity. It was not vanity. It was a ritual of control, a quiet act of ownership over the only thing on her person that belonged unquestionably to her. She let her breath slow again. She counted. She affirmed to herself, not as comfort, but as precision, that she had survived uglier rooms than this. The first officer's patience thinned. The alcohol had sanded down whatever thin veneer of caution he usually wore in public. The hand that came toward her this time did not hide its intention. It stationed itself on her hip, fingers curving with a proprietary finality that transformed the moment from prelude to offense. She jerked free again, the motion so swift that the silk of the dress hissed. The heel of her hand cut across his wrist and knocked it away. Her voice arrived at last, not raised but ironed flat. The kind of voice that makes people turn their heads in courts and boardrooms, even though no one is shouting. "You will not touch me again." The words did not break anything. They did not break him. They did not open the door or call the guard or conjure the crowd. But they did break the pretense. The first officer's grin died, and in its place came the bewildered hostility of a man discovering that his costume does not make him invincible. The second officer's features hardened into that sloppy contempt that sits right next to rage. His laughter evaporated, leaving only the wet smell of his drink. The third officer's eyes flicked once to the camera, then back to her, as if weighing whether the lens was as blind as the people in the ballroom. He moved first, the one at her left. Not a strike. A shove, low and quick, the kind that aims to turn a person sideways so that the next hand can catch the exposed part of the body as it twists. Her shoulder hit the column, and cold ran through her dress like a blade. She used the pivot to slide out of the trap he had set for her, stepping forward instead of back, making his assumption fail by one crucial angle. He found himself reaching for empty space. He swore again, louder, and that was the first sound of the night that might have carried through the glass if the music had not chosen that precise second to swell with brass. She could feel a tremor beginning in her hands, and she would not let it grow into anything they could use. She placed her palms flat against the column for a second and pressed, not in submission, not in prayer, but in the practical work of returning her limbs to her. She turned sharply so that her back was not fully to any one of them. She saw the lawn, the path, the dark line of the trees. She saw the lot beyond, where a car crouched without lights like an animal that had decided stillness makes it invisible. She saw the red ribbon pinned to the lapel of a man inside the ballroom, a blur behind glass, stroking the stem of his glass with 2 fingers, absolutely certain the world was good. Another hand came, and this one did not pretend to be a slip. It found her lower and harsher than any previous touch. The shock of it turned the night momentarily white. She wrenched away with a force that surprised even herself, and felt the fabric near her waist strain with the movement. The second officer, the one who had laughed, stumbled again, startled into a brief, ugly silence. The first officer's eyes flashed with the insult of resistance. The third stepped closer, his posture changing in a way that made the uniform seem like a theft. She did not break. She took 3 deliberate breaths. She let her anger stack those breaths into a scaffold she could stand on. She had the thought then, quick and precise, that the camera must be seeing this in frames wide enough to be understood by anyone who might need to see it later. She lifted her hands in a posture that denied consent, without provoking a fresh assault, elbows in, palms out, not a fighter's stance, but a refusal. She was not here to win a contest. She was here to outlast the minute or 2 that separated her from either intervention or escape. They were drunk on more than liquor. They were drunk on an idea that a door, a uniform, and a dark edge of a well-lit party add up to immunity. The first officer reached again, And this time there was a clumsiness at the edge of his confidence, the slip that often precedes the fall. He caught her forearm, hard enough to make the skin beneath her bracelet throb, and jerked her toward him. She twisted inward toward the grip, not away from it, the counterintuitive motion that ends leverage rather than increases it, and his fingers lost their purchase. He hissed a breath through his teeth, angry now not with a person, but with a principle. He was the sort who finds the laws of motion insulting when they do not favor him. The pendant at her throat swung and struck the column with a faint metallic note. The sound felt louder in her mind than on the air. She looked toward the glass, and in its slick surface saw the shapes they made together, like a tableau in a cautionary painting. The woman sat back against a pillar, the three men arranged around her in a geometry of theft. The ballroom beyond, with its floating lights and moving shadows and unbroken peace. A thought drifted to the top of her mind and settled there with the weight of a fact. Later, when this was retold, someone would say she should have screamed. Someone always says that. They have never been on a terrace with the music inside and three men outside, and a door that only looks like an exit. He shoved her then, not with all his strength, but with enough to make her back strike the stone. Her shoulders met at first, then the back of her head lightly enough to sting. Her breath left her and returned in a rush, bringing the iron taste of outrage with it. A flood of heat rose behind her eyes and went nowhere. She let it become clarity. She kept her voice level. She told them again to stop. She said it because names matter, because a record matters, because even if the room would not hear her, the camera might, in someone later, would not be able to say he did not know which part of this was wrong. The first officer moved close enough that she could count the pores in his skin. He wanted to use the size of him as a tool, the way cowards use numbers and shadows in uniforms. He thought the door was a wall and the glass a curtain. He thought the night had chosen a side. He reached once more to finish what he believed he had started, and in the narrow band of reflection near the edge of the glass, she finally saw something else, something not belonging to the three of them or to her. A figure had appeared inside the lobby, just beyond the double doors, a dark shape cutting the gold of the interior light. He was moving at an ordinary pace, not yet hurrying, not yet aware, not yet decided, only present. For a second, nothing changed in the world except her eyes. Hope, the steady kind that stands upright rather than kneeling to plead, rose into her throat and settled there like a held breath. She did not let it distract her. Hope has to be managed like any other powerful force. She kept her focus on the three men outside with her. She kept her feet planted and her hands ready to reject the next touch. The music shifted to a brighter key, as if the band had chosen a tune that belonged to earlier in the night. The terrace lights flickered once as the wind moved, turning the stone momentarily silver. The first officer's palm hovered again at the edge of her dress, like a verdict about to be read. The second braced himself with the idiot certainty of a man who has no idea he has just gambled away his career. The third took half a step to the side to adjust his angle, and then the figure inside the lobby came closer to the glass, the hat brim cutting the glare, the shoulders set, the walk unmistakable even if one had only ever seen it on a screen. He did not stride. He did not rush. He came as though he were part of the original design of the place, as though the architecture had been built to conduct him to this exact point at this exact second. The officers did not see him yet. They were still watching their own reflection, believing themselves the story. The woman in the red dress kept her gaze on them and let the knowledge of the approach sit where it could not betray itself in her face. She stood without trembling. She let her hands fall into readiness rather than defense. She stared the first officer straight through the smile he was trying to grow again, like a weed in the cracks of decency, and she waited out one last breath of the night that had thought it could hide this from the morning. The wind lifted the hem of her dress and laid it back down. The pendant cooled against her skin. Somewhere, just out of sight, a door hinge whispered the smallest complaint. The first officer placed his hand on her again. It was the last thing he set there of his own accord. The hand that touched her for the final time did not stay there long enough for the moment to fully register as victory in the mind of the man who placed it. Before he could tighten his grip or shape the next word in his mouth, another presence entered the scene, silent at first, then sharply undeniable. The sound was not a shout, not a warning, not the dramatic crack of breaking tension, but something much smaller. The steady rhythm of approaching footsteps on stone. It was the kind of sound that doesn't demand attention, only earns it, the way a tide replaces a ripple without ever needing to announce the sea behind it. The first officer turned, irritated, expecting a staff member or a wandering guest to shoo away. He opened his mouth with a kind of drunken confidence meant to intimidate before he even saw who stood there. And then he did see. The words dissolved like sugar in rain. Chuck Norris stood just beyond the edge of the terrace lights, the shadow of his hat rim drawn across his eyes, the lines of his face sharper in the contrast of night and gold. He did not hurry. He did not posture. He did not ask what was happening. He had already seen enough. His gaze traveled from the closest man to the second, then to the third, calculating with the mechanical precision of someone who had spent a lifetime studying not fights, but the anatomy of violence. He saw positions, distances, balance, the angle of feet, the state of their coordination, the looseness in their posture born not from fatigue, but from alcohol. He saw everything. None of the officers spoke at first. The one closest to his wife dropped his hand, not out of remorse, but out of the instinctive recognition that something had entered the scene that did not bend, did not fear, and did not need to explain itself. The second officer stiffened his shoulders, trying to piece together the swagger he'd worn like armor minutes before, only to find it had slipped off him somewhere between the first drink and the first boundary crossed. The third, stationed now halfway between the door and the lawn, placed his hand on his belt near the holster, not to draw, not yet, but as a silent signal that he believed the badge gave him the authority to stand his ground. Chuck didn't look at the badge. He didn't need to. He looked at the men wearing it, and that was enough. He spoke, calm, voice low enough to force them to listen rather than react. No threat, no dramatic declaration, only the kind of question that leaves no exit but honesty. The officer nearest his wife tried to answer, but his voice stumbled. He said they were just talking. His tone pretended innocence, but his eyes could not decide whether to stay on Chuck or drift back to the place on her body where his hand had been. The lie fell apart in the space between syllables. Chuck didn't step closer. He didn't need to. The stillness in his posture was made of tension, coiled into patience, like a drawn bow waiting for the right angle. The silence that followed felt larger than the terrace itself. The officers felt it too. Even through the fog of alcohol, they felt that what was coming would not be stopped by a badge, or rank, or darkness, or denial. They were not in control of the scene anymore. They had been rented control by circumstance, and the lease had just expired. The first officer tried to recover his balance with words. He pointed at the door, claimed authority, claimed duty, claimed misunderstanding. But authority issued by the state has rules, and every rule forbids the thing his hand had done. Duty cannot be invoked while standing in the wreckage of it, and misunderstanding has limits that alcohol had already erased. Chuck's wife moved then, not to hide behind him, not to cling to him, but to step out of the triangle the men had formed around her. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her composure told the truth long before she ever would in words. There was no need to describe what had happened. It was visible in the way she held her shoulders, in the slight bruise forming where fingers had pressed too hard, in the way she no longer needed to touch the pendant at her throat to stay steady. She was steady now. He was here. That was all the officers needed to read to feel the shift. The second one took a short step toward Chuck in a half-drawn motion of drunken bravado, and that was all it took. The tension passed instantly from waiting to action. Chuck moved, not with the explosive fury of a bar fight, but with the precision of someone solving a problem he had already mapped out. His hand caught the man's wrist before it could form a fist, turned it, locked the joint, and drove the man's balance downward with nothing more than redirected weight. The officer hit the stone with a grunt, not injured, but removed from the equation. The first officer lunged, slow and predictable, telegraphing every intention with a drunken shift of shoulder. Chuck stepped aside, caught the man's momentum by the collar, and redirected it into a hard collision with the metal frame of the terrace railing. The officer dropped, winded, not knowing whether he had fallen or been placed there by the law of physics or by the man who had rewritten that law for him in 3 seconds. Only the third remained upright, hands still near his holster, staring at Chuck with the wide-eyed confusion of a man who has never before been the slowest person in a room. He hesitated, just long enough to prove that he didn't actually want to draw the weapon, before his instincts forced him to act anyway. His hands snapped down to unclip the holster, and that was the moment the fight was over. Not because a gun had entered the scene, but because the decision to reach for it had already surrendered control. Chuck closed the distance in a single step, his palm striking the officer's forearm in a sharp, downward arc that broke the draw before it began. The gun stayed in the holster. The officer doubled over from the shock, not pain, just the abrupt interruption of will by reality. In the next second, the man was on the ground, not bleeding, not broken, just disarmed in every way that mattered. 3 men, 3 badges, 3 uniforms, all breathing, all conscious, all defeated without a single theatrical blow. It was not a fight. It was the removal of danger. It was a correction. Chuck didn't look at them once they were down. He looked only at his wife, studying her expression, searching the silence behind it. She nodded once. He put a hand gently on her shoulder, not claiming, not shielding, just confirming that she was still standing and would remain so. Behind them, the door to the ballroom had opened. Staff were hurrying out, drawn by movement and noise they hadn't expected. Voices rose in shock. Someone was calling hotel security. Someone else was already speaking into a phone, asking for the nearest active police unit to respond, unaware that the men who needed arresting were the ones already lying on the terrace tiles. Chuck remained still, letting the world catch up to what had already happened. The path from violence to justice would begin now, but the violence was over. He had not punished anyone. He had only stopped them. And the first man who would try to speak his way out of it didn't realize that the cameras above them, all 4 of them, had recorded every second. The night was no longer silent. The music inside had stopped. The storm had been spent. And what remained was not chaos, but consequence. And consequence had just begun its work. The terrace, moments earlier a stage for fear and violence, was now crowded with the sound of hurried footsteps, shocked voices, and the crash of urgency against disbelief. The hotel staff, who had been trained to handle spilled champagne and fainting guests but not fallen police officers, hovered in a ring of hesitation, unsure whether to assist, to intervene, or to simply stay out of the way. The 3 men on the ground were no longer a threat, only evidence breathing, conscious but stripped of authority in a way that no courtroom could have done more cleanly. The badges on their chests still gleamed beneath the terrace lights, but whatever power those badges once held had dissolved the moment they were used as shields for cruelty instead of symbols of protection. Hotel security arrived first, moving with the uneasy caution of men who understood that they were entering a scene already larger than their job description. They exchanged glances with each other, then with Chuck, and found in his silence all the explanation they needed. None of them asked if force had been necessary. That answer lay on the officers' faces that carried the shock of men who had expected consequences for others, never for themselves. One of the security guards radioed the front desk, requesting immediate police backup from a different district, the kind that would not hesitate to arrest their own. The request was framed with careful, practiced neutrality, no accusation. Just facts. 3 off-duty officers, intoxicated, involved in an altercation with a guest. Possible assault. Possible intoxication while in possession of state-issued firearms. The kind of report that could not be buried when spoken aloud. Inside the ballroom, word spread faster than the staff could contain it. The music had cut off mid-measure when the door opened, and now there was only the murmur of confusion and the sharp undercurrent of alarm. Guests stepped out into the patio corridor in small clusters, caution painted onto their polished expressions. The sight that met them, 3 uniformed officers on the ground, Chuck Norris standing beside his wife, and hotel staff positioned between both sides, was not one the evening planners had imagined. It was the kind of scene that ruptures the illusion of safety money is supposed to buy. What followed did not unfold with the chaos of panic, but with the slow, deliberate gravity of truth coming into view. The hotel director approached Chuck and his wife with a reverence that bordered on apology, as though the entire institution felt responsible for having failed them. He spoke with care, asked if she was injured, offered her a private room, offered medical attention, offered silence if she preferred privacy, offered witnesses if she preferred justice. She accepted neither panic nor pity. She wanted only accurate answers and documented facts, things she knew would matter in the hours ahead. One of the staff members had already accessed the security office, scrubbing through footage from the terrace cameras. The recording had captured everything: the arrival of the police car, the slow tightening of the circle around her, the first unwanted touch, the escalation, the shove against the column, and the moment Chuck appeared. Not a single frame could be dismissed as speculation or emotion. The truth had been filmed, not told. There would be no need to debate whose memory was clearer. The evidence had already taken sides. When the responding officers finally arrived, they approached the scene with visible discomfort. Not because of Chuck's reputation, but because of what it meant to place handcuffs on men who wore the same uniform they did. But procedure demanded action, and the facts left no room for hesitation. Breathalyzer tests were performed. Weapons were collected. The three officers, red-eyed and furious for all the wrong reasons, were lifted to their feet and processed like any other violent offenders who had used authority to camouflage intent. And it was then that the pieces began to connect. While their IDs were checked and their records pulled, the hotel legal liaison, who happened to be a partner in the charity's legal department, began recognizing names. Two of the arrested men had been mentioned before in private reports from women who had been too afraid to file anything official. A bartender had once complained about their behavior. A motel clerk had told a story about a frightened guest who fled during a traffic stop. A paramedic had left a voicemail months ago, describing misconduct during a late-night call. But none of those accounts had ever led anywhere. Too few witnesses, no footage, no evidence, just fear against authority, and authority always won by reputation alone. Until tonight. And tonight there were cameras. There were witnesses. There was an indisputable display of what they had done, not just to one woman, but to the badge they carried. Chuck watched the process unfold with the same quiet control he'd shown on the terrace. He didn't demand arrests, didn't shout for justice, didn't threaten lawyers or reporters. He simply stood beside his wife as she watched the men who had tried to intimidate her now stand with their hands cuffed, their eyes red, not with shame, but with the rage of men who had been caught. The hotel director apologized again, this time not formally, but sincerely, as a man apologizes when something inside his world has cracked in a way he can't repair. She nodded, not absolving anyone, simply acknowledging that the fracture had been seen and understood. Then came the press. Not because anyone called them, but because a police arrest in formal wear outside a luxury charity event at midnight is not the kind of thing that stays off scanners. Satellite vans began appearing at the end of the drive. Reporters were already assembling questions like daggers they planned to throw. The hotel staff tried to delay them. Lawyers tried to slow them. But news has a way of reaching the door before the people inside are ready to open it. And in that moment, when the world seemed ready to make a spectacle out of what had already been a violation, Chuck did what he always had done best. He refused to turn truth into entertainment. He and his wife stepped away from the lights, not running, not hiding, but choosing not to stand as trophies for headlines. They didn't need to speak. The recorded footage would speak louder than any interview. Justice wouldn't happen tonight, but it had started. Later, in a private suite that had been cleared for them, Chuck's wife sat near the window, finally free from the noise, the questions, and the rehearsed sympathy of strangers. The view stretched over the sleeping grounds of the hotel. Quiet now, with no sign of what had occurred except the faint glow of police lights fading down the road. A blanket rested around her shoulders, not because she was cold, but because someone had offered comfort, and for once she had accepted it. Chuck sat beside her, not speaking, because silence was not neglect, it was permission. Permission for her to breathe, permission for her not to be strong, permission for the moment to belong to her, not to the narrative others would write about it. And yet, even in that silence, there was something forming, not just closure, but purpose. Because what had happened tonight was not just an attack, it was a revelation. and revelations demand answers. The camera footage would go to the investigators. The statements would go to the district attorney. The officers would go to suspension, then trial, then sentencing. But none of that was enough to keep this from happening to someone else. And that was when her decision began to take shape, not in anger, but in clarity. Someone had to make sure that justice didn't depend on luck. Someone had to make sure that the next woman wouldn't have to hope a camera was working, or that a husband arrived in time, or that the world suddenly cared. Someone had to build something permanent, something louder than silence and stronger than fear. She lifted her hand to the pendant at her throat, calmly this time, not for steadiness, but as a vow. The legal system would deal with the men who attacked her, but she would deal with the system that had allowed them to thrive. That work would begin tomorrow. Tonight, justice had awakened. Tomorrow it would move. Dawn arrived slowly, as if the world itself were hesitant to acknowledge the events of the night before. The hotel grounds looked untouched, clean and still, as though the violence that had taken place had been nothing more than a passing shadow. The same paths gleamed under the pale morning light. The same trimmed hedges framed the fountain. The same flags on the rooftop swayed gently in the early wind. Nothing in the physical world bore the weight of what had changed, but the people inside the building were no longer the same. By the time most guests woke, the 3 officers who had arrived under the cover of authority were already in holding cells, waiting for their blood alcohol levels to be cataloged into official record. Their badges had been logged as evidence, not credentials. Their guns had been sealed. Their silence had not come from dignity, but from the sudden realization that for the first time in years, they were not the ones who would be believed first. In the very same police department that once shielded them, paperwork had begun to accumulate, not in their favor, but against them. And the camera footage, clear and damning, had already been copied into 3 secured archives, including one held by the legal team connected to the charity event. Justice had not been served yet, but the path to it had been opened, and this time, unlike every complaint that had died before it, nothing would be buried. In the quiet suite above the courtyard, Chuck and his wife sat at a small breakfast table, untouched coffee cooling in porcelain cups between them. The night had left exhaustion behind, but not defeat. She had slept only a few hours, long enough to recover her breath, but not enough to outrun memory. And yet she did not look broken. She looked resolved. There was no need to speak about what had happened. They both knew the truth too clearly to require retelling. What mattered now was everything that followed, and the decisions would not belong to lawyers or reporters or the crowd eager for headlines. They would belong to her. She didn't want revenge. Revenge was small, temporary, a flame that burned hot and then died, leaving the world no safer than before. What she wanted instead was something lasting, something large enough to ensure that the next woman facing abuse from a badge or a boss or a stranger in a hallway would not face it alone. It began not with a speech or a declaration, but with a sentence spoken so simply that it carried more weight than anger ever could. "It can't just end with them being arrested," she said. Chuck nodded once, not to agree for agreement's sake, but because he had already known she would say it. By midday, the legal foundation that had hosted the charity event had already offered its full support. Not for a lawsuit, though one would come. Not for a press conference, though the media frenzy would demand one. But for something larger, the creation of a program dedicated to protecting victims of abuse committed by people in positions of power: law enforcement, military, private security, employers with unchecked authority. It would begin with funding, then expand into legal aid, crisis housing partnerships, investigative support, and trauma counseling funded, not by emotion, but by structure. The organizers, shaken by what had happened right outside their own gala, did not hesitate. Grants were drafted, a board was outlined, a team of attorneys volunteered to take the first steps. What had begun as a charity evening would now become the starting point of a long-form justice initiative, one with teeth, reach, and permanence. She would not be its figurehead, she would be its architect. And Chuck, who had built a legacy on strength, on discipline, on the mythology of being unbreakable, chose to stand not in front of her, but beside her. Even legends know when it is not their name that needs to lead. News outlets, unaware yet of how carefully this future was being shaped, began running headlines built for shock value. 3 police officers assaulted the wife of a legendary action star. Chuck Norris stopped them with his bare hands. The story was irresistible, too cinematic to resist, too easy to turn into a spectacle. Reporters crowded the entrance of the hotel, begging for a statement, a soundbite, a dramatic retelling. But neither Chuck nor his wife stepped outside. Because the truth was bigger than the punchline they wanted. Because the story was not about a fight. It was about the system that had allowed those men to walk into the night believing no one would ever stop them. And she intended to make certain that belief died, not just for 3 officers, but for anyone who ever planned to hide behind a badge again. Over the next week, Internal Affairs opened multiple past complaints, long thought unsubstantiated. Witnesses began coming forward now that they knew someone powerful had seen what they were once too afraid to describe. A bartender, a paramedic, a motel clerk, a woman who had never filed a report because she was told no one would believe her over a police officer. Now they would be believed. Now the evidence would not vanish from a drawer. And on the day the Charity Foundation formally announced the launch of the new initiative, a legal, financial, and psychological support network for victims of law-enforced abuse. The woman in the red dress did not speak of what had been done to her. She spoke of what would no longer be done to others. The audience that heard her speak didn't see a victim. They saw a woman who had been tested by the darkest face of authority and had turned the experience into fuel, not for rage, but for reconstruction. Chuck stood among the crowd, not on stage, not as a symbol, but as a witness. When people spoke to him afterward, most expected him to describe the fight, the takedowns, the moment he stopped the men who threatened her. He did not. He only said the one thing that mattered. Stopping them was the easy part. Fixing the world that created them, that's the real fight. And those words spread faster and lasted longer than any headline about punches thrown. Weeks later, when the couple finally left the hotel and returned to their own home, they walked down the same stone steps that had been polished for the gala night. The morning was bright, without wind, and the gravel crunched beneath their footsteps in unison. Her dress was no longer red and silk. It was simple, comfortable, ordinary. But the pendant she wore was the same, and now it did not tremble against her skin. It rested, steady. They passed by the terrace, not lingering, not haunted by it. She looked at the column where her back had struck stone, not with dread, but with a strange sense of quiet victory. The place where terror once stood was now just a piece of architecture, stripped of power. That is the nature of justice, not as punishment, but as repair. It does not erase the memory. It replaces the ending. When the car door closed and the engine rumbled to life, the hotel behind them looked exactly as it had the night they arrived. But somewhere inside, a room now held the contracts for a new national initiative. A computer held the camera footage that would turn into testimony. A young legal intern was drafting outreach letters for women who had never been heard before. Something permanent had begun. And far from the cameras, far from the applause, far from the retellings, the truth remained simple. 3 men had tried to break a woman because they believed they could. And instead, they broke the silence of every woman who would follow. Not because of Chuck's fists, but because of what she built afterward. And somewhere in cities and towns not yet touched by this story, other women would go to sleep tonight not knowing that something had changed for them already, something invisible, but waiting. Protection had been planted. Justice had been set in motion. And the next time someone asked a woman what chance she had against men like that, the answer would be different. Because this time, she would not be standing alone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, share the video, and check out the next ones on the channel.